All right, today on Humanities, we are going to be looking at the religion associated with the prophet Zarathustra. This is continuing, again, the theme of religions of the ancient Near East. So we covered the first religious topic, which was on the Mesopotamian religion found in Sumeria and Babylonia. Then we went on and looked at ancient Egyptian religion, and from there we spent a little bit of time looking specifically at the Amarna period with the revolution that was attributed to the pharaoh Akhenaten. I think that was the last session. Today we're going to take a look at Zarathustra and the religion that is going to become known as Zoroastrianism, and this is going to be something situated really in Persia, though it spreads well beyond Persia. So let's take a look at the material in the PowerPoint. And if you've studied world religions in the past, you may have come across this particular religion. I know not every world religion course is going to cover religions from all different periods of time, but you may have come across Zoroastrianism because it is not just an ancient religion. This is a religion that is still around. There's still people that practice Zoroastrianism today. Of course, not in the numbers that they've had in the past. So I'll hopefully cover a little bit about the remains of Zoroastrianism in the modern day after I get through the background for Zoroastrianism, if I don't forget to do that. So let's take a look at first Zoroaster or Zarathustra. Zarathustra Haikataspos Pitama. Zoroaster is actually the Greek form of the name, and that's what he's most well known as in the West. Now, when did he live? It's very hard to say. We've got wide-ranging dates that stretch from about 3000 BC on. So a lot of people put him around 1200 BC. Most scholars, I believe, put him around 600, and that's the date that I'm going to go with. And the reason for 600 has to do with a couple attempts to date him by the ancients themselves. He was often dated in respect to the life of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, of course, we really haven't studied yet, but we will. We mentioned him in his conquest of Persia, which happened during the 4th century. But the people that chronicle the life of Zarathustra date him several hundred years prior to Alexander, which puts him around the time of 600. And you also have names that show up in the material trying to recount the story of Zarathustra's background. And some of those names were actually common during the time of the Achaemenid Empire. So if you remember, the Achaemenid Empire is the Persian Empire founded by Cyrus the Great back in the 6th century, and is going to go until Alexander actually conquers it in the 4th century. So for a couple hundred years, you've got this empire in existence. And historically, there are certain names that come into style and go out of style over time. So the main name that's usually picked up on in the legend is the King Vistaspa, which is a name that would have been appropriate around that time. So it's a good general idea about when he may have lived, but like I said, it's still a little bit of speculation. Now, where exactly he lived is another question. We don't know. Usually identified with the regions of northeastern Iran. Specifically, again, we can't say. The idea that he had something to do with this king by the name of Vistaspa connects him kind of to that region, maybe what is known as Bactria, maybe later Afghanistan. And the tradition that we have is a later tradition that tries to give us a little bit of a biography, but again, this is legendary material. So according to the stories, he was an Indo-Aryan priest, meaning he was a priest of a polytheistic religion of gods that were very similar to some of the gods you'll see in the Hindu pantheon, or rather I should say the pre-Hindu pantheon in the Vedic era. If you're not familiar with ancient India, the Indo-Aryan peoples move in or start migrating into the region of India, northern India, in, say, around 1600 BC or possibly a little earlier. It's a long period of migration, and they're responsible for what is known as the Vedic religion and the composition of what are known as the Vedas. This is like the oldest religious material from India. And it lists a number of gods that are also common to ancient Persia. Okay, so these people were related linguistically and religiously, culturally. Now, according to the story, he is visited one day by this being known as Vohumana, kind of an angelic figure, which tells him to abandon his polytheism and embrace the single true God known as Ahura Mazda. Now, he does this. He converts and he abandons the polytheism, begins to preach what is monotheism. We have already defined monotheism. I'll probably define it again for you on another slide. But again, it's the worship of one God only. As far as his preaching goes, he's not hugely successful during his lifetime. His main convert is this king that I mentioned, Vistaspa, or sometimes it's called Hystaspes. And with the conversion of the king comes the conversion of the king's realm. Okay. Now this happens historically. It's not always very successful. We saw Akhenaten attempt to convert all of Egypt, and that was a dreadful failure. But historically, you do see this happen at various periods. Various Germanic kings that convert to Christianity, like Clovis in the Frankish kingdom, kind of brings along the kingdom of the Franks into the area of Orthodox Christianity. Back in the 5th century, late 5th century A.D. Okay, so these things do happen historically. So there's no reason that this wouldn't have been possible. The story goes on to say that Zarathustra is murdered later in life. He begins his preaching maybe in his 30s and dies, I think, somewhere in his 60s or somewhere thereabouts, while he's tending the sacred fire in the temple by some marauders that come in, and it's kind of the end of him. Now, again, this is legendary material. We don't know how much is true, how much is just concocted to give a little bit of a biography, because people generally like to have stories of their founders. Anyways, let's talk about the growth and spread of the religion. Like I said, during Zarathustra's life, it was a very slow growth. After his time, it's going to continue to grow and spread in 3 basic periods. And I'm identifying the major periods of the Persian empires, starting with the Achaemenid period. So this would be the old or first great Persian empire. And I mentioned Cyrus was the founder, but we find the earliest inscriptions referring to the god of the religion during the time of Darius. The Behistun inscription, which I know I mentioned to you, and what you see on the screen, is this great inscription left by Darius to kind of recount his rise to power, and doesn't necessarily mean that he was a worshiper. We don't know the significance of the name at that point in time or for Darius. So I'll talk a little bit about this name as it might relate to some of the earlier religious traditions, because it appears that Ahura or Ahura Mazda was already a name in use prior to the reforms of Zarathustra. So just the fact that he mentions this god doesn't mean he was a devotee of the religion or a worshiper of this god only. It may be this god among others, okay? By the time you get to Artaxerxes, some people speculate that he was the first to actually officially adopt the Zoroastrian calendar, which would indicate that he's kind of moving towards a stricter adherence to the faith. And you do see, even after his time, invocations of Ahura Mazda along with other gods. Now, does that mean there's still polytheism mixed in, again, among the Achaemenid hierarchy? It's hard to say, because some of the names that show up that we know of as gods like Mithra and Anahita, shown up on the screen here, were also characters mentioned in Zoroastrianism as lesser beings. And I'll kind of go through some of the divine beings in the religion in a little bit. So again, the idea here is we don't really know what level the religion has spread to. Did it actually already come into the ruling family of the Persians, or this is just still kind of a mixture of polytheism at this phase? Anyways, the Parthian era, which follows the conquest of Alexander the Great, this is going to begin in the 3rd century and run into the 3rd century AD. So for that period of about 500 years, you have the religion really start to spread, and you're going to have variations in the religion at different places throughout the empire, sort of on the local level. And you also have more references to this particular group known as the Magi, or the Magi. Now, we don't know very much about these guys. If you've heard the term Magi before, it might be in the context of the nativity story that you get in the New Testament, right? The birth of Jesus and the 3 wise men. They're referred to as Magi or Magi. Don't know exactly what they were. There's different theories as to whether or not they were Zoroastrian priests, whether or not this is a priestly tribal designation, or whether it's a term that refers to just a particular tribe, or if it refers to magicians of some sort. As a matter of fact, the root word there does come to be used by the Greeks for a magician. But generally, people do assume that the Magi had something to do with Zoroastrian religion, maybe as priests. Okay, so you start to see them maybe involved in the spreading of the faith. The Parthians themselves don't ever make it an official religion, but when we get to their successor kingdom, which is the Sasanian Empire, starting again in the 3rd century AD and moving all the way up to the Arabic conquest of Iran, you have really a Zoroastrian state for the first time. This is where the religion is not only embraced, but it's made, at least at times, the official and only acceptable religion within Persia. The famous priest Kartir was one of the militant promoters of the religion. Had influence over a number of different kings. He, I think, was one of the high priests over the reign of like 4 or 5 different Sasanian kings, and was able to actually begin the persecution and oppression of non-Zoroastrians during that particular time period in the 3rd century. Persecution of Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Manichaeans. As a matter of fact, the prophet of Manichaeism, the prophet Mani, was actually executed under the influence of Kartir. So he was really, really a very aggressive promoter. Of course, his influence eventually wanes, and Zoroastrianism tends to be fairly tolerant, which Persia was prior to his dominance. But the religion definitely spread. When it starts to decline is going to be during the Muslim era. So the Islamic era, which begins, it's kind of a lengthy conquest between 641, 651. Persia is conquered by the Arabs, and the people that are Zoroastrian that were already living there have a bit of tolerance extended to them under Muslim occupation. The designation that you'll find in Islam, people of the book, was a particular class that included Jews, Christians, and in this period later, Zoroastrians. So the peoples of the book were distinguished from polytheists, the pagans, which were usually oppressed under Islam. The peoples of the book were given a certain amount of freedom. They were put into a position often known as a dhimmi status. And the Zoroastrians had that protection. So you have still a fairly large Zoroastrian community that exists in Persia really up until about the 10th, 11th century. And under the influence of certain leaders that persecuted Zoroastrians, and even maybe the idea of the status of being dhimmi. Again, we're going to get into Islam later this semester, but when you're a dhimmi, you have certain freedoms extended to you, but it's still kind of a second-class position where there are different taxes, different things you can and can't do, different ways you are supposed to dress to distinguish you from Muslims, etc. With this idea of kind of restricted freedom, even though you're still free, a lot of people would have converted to Islam basically to avoid, that second-class status. It was very easy to do that. And around that time, you start to see more of an exodus from Persia into India. So today, when you look at the Zoroastrian community that survives, you still have a small group in Iran, but the largest portion of Zoroastrians exists today in India. And it's not a very large community. You're talking, maybe 100,000 or thereabouts in existence. It's kind of a dwindling religion. They tend not to marry outside the faith. And, it's based basically on the birth rate, how long the religion's going to survive. Anyways, so that's kind of a basic rundown of the growth and spread of the religion. What I want to go to now is looking at the classification of the religion and then some of the beliefs and practices of the religion. So let's start with this terminology, monotheism and dualism. We've already seen monotheism and polytheism, so belief in many gods, belief in one God. So I said Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion, which it is, but during periods, it actually merges or morphs into what we might call a dualistic religion. Now, the word dualism can be used in different ways. We're actually going to see it later in the context of philosophy, particularly with Plato. But in the context of religion here, we're looking at a type of religion that is going to involve two opposing forces. I guess you could think of in China, the Taoism, the idea of yin yang. That's a kind of dualism there, where there's a kind of a unity between opposites. In this form of dualism, you still have a light and dark, good and evil dichotomy, but they're more oppositional than harmonious. Okay, so in the form of religion that evolves here, you're going to see a good God, which is going to be Ahura Mazda, facing off against an evil force, which I'll get to a little bit later. Now, I don't want to make it sound like these are equal and opposite, but it's a form of polytheism if you think about it as, more than one God. So it's a simplified version. So we could look at Zoroastrianism in the ancient period as dualistic at some periods, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the previous polytheism first. So we already mentioned that you have the Indo-Aryan tradition coming into India and into Persia. In both of those areas, you've got classes of beings, the Ahuras and the Devas. Actually, in India, they're called the Asuras and the Devas. In India, there's going to be a struggle between the two classes, and the Devas are going to come out as kind of the preeminent deities. In Persia, it's a little bit the opposite, and this is due to the influence of Zarathustra. You've got the Ahuras, which are probably the older gods, the gods of the heavens, and then the Devas, which are maybe the lower gods or the younger generation of gods. And, there's many gods in each category. When Zarathustra comes along and starts to preach monotheism, he exalts a character that's probably the leader of the Ahura group in the older pantheon. So Ahura is the name that is going to be attached to the one god now. So the theory is that there was a great Ahura, which would be a corresponding figure to the Indian religious figure of Varuna. Now, there are other theories beyond this one. I'm just going to give you one particular view. And the reason this might have a little bit of support is in Indian mythology, you've got the god Varuna, who's often connected to another god by the name of Mitra. Often the names are written together, like Varuna Mitra or Mitra Varuna. So there's something really close about those two figures. In Zoroastrian texts, you will see the Persian counterpart, Mithra, often associated with Ahura, okay? Usually as a servant, because it's not going to be polytheism anymore. But because of that, close connection, it's speculated that originally Ahura would have been the counterpart to Varuna. He's promoted to the position as sole and only god, and then Mithra would have been demoted to a position of an angelic servant of Ahura, okay? And I'll get to some of those other characters later. So what happens to all these gods? Well, some of the gods do become servants, like I said, but other gods, particularly from the Deva category, become demonized. Now, these Devas become kind of like the evil spirits that inhabit the world, and it's from this actual process that we end up getting the word Deva as the root for the word devil. Okay, as a matter of fact, the word Deva, Devi, in the Indo-European language is the root word for divinity, divine, deity, all these other different cognates. The word devil is actually related to the word for God. But it's because of this particular movement that you get that negative connotation. Okay? Anyways, Ahura Mazda is the only god, often translated as the wise lord or the good god. And you end up moving towards dualism, specifically during the Sasanian period, due to a particular story that I'm going to get to in a second. Okay, so sometimes you got one god taught, sometimes two gods. But you don't ever worship two gods, right? The people that follow Zarathustra's teaching only worship the good god, as you would expect. You don't worship the evil god. It's not like ancient Satanism or anything like that. Now, the confusion is basically based on what Zarathustra taught about what are called the twin spirits. So let me give you a little bit of a background on the twin spirits. This comes from the Avesta, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, where you have these two spirits that are apparently created by Ahura Mazda. One spirit chooses good, one spirit chooses evil. And based on that choice, you've got the names the Spentamanyu, which kind of means the Holy Spirit, and Angramanyu, which basically means the evil or the fiendish spirit. And now you have these two spirits, which are obviously opposites. Well, what do you make of this? This actually raises a theological problem and a theological question. So let's look at the question. Now, when I use the word independent or dependent, what I mean by those terms is obtaining your existence from something. Okay, that would be a dependence. Independence means you exist without requiring reliance on another's existence or creation. So let me give you the question, and then I'll unpack that a little bit. The question was the evil spirit, the Angra Mainyu, independent or dependent on Ahura Mazda? Meaning, was this spirit separate from Angra Mainyu, having nothing to do with Angra Mainyu, or was it dependent on Ahura Mazda for its existence? Now, there's a theological...
It was dependent on Uruhara for existence because he created them.
Okay, well, that's going to be the question. All right, so hold on for the answer now. Because the theological dilemma is this. If you go in one way, Ahura Mazda is responsible for creating evil if he's dependent. If he's independent, then you have two gods. Now, most of the ancient Zoroastrian thinkers did not want to make Ahura Mazda responsible for the creation of evil and chose to interpret it the other way. So what you end up with is a second god who is lesser in power, lesser in intellect, but still opposed to Ahura Mazda. And that's where we get the dualism from. Okay? Now, there's another version of the religion that springs from this concept, and it's what's called Zurvanism. Now, Zurvanism is not, or at least at the time, was considered a heretical movement, which tries to account for the twin spirits by positing a third god, okay? And this god would be known as Zurvan, which I'll talk about again a little bit later, but Zurvan was kind of a neutral, neither good nor bad, being who created the twin spirits. Now, according to that account, of course, the good spirit ends up becoming identified with Ahura Mazda and the evil spirit opposed to him, right? Now, how this is interpreted today varies. A lot of more modern Zoroastrians are in favor of interpreting the whole story of the twin spirits as a metaphor for the existence of freedom and free will. All right, not everybody actually believes in a literal Angra Mainyu or that this story was ever meant to be a literal explanation, but metaphor. It's symbolic of the idea that we have freedom and we have the ability to choose between the two. And this is probably, some people think maybe what Zarathustra had in mind when he taught the story. So when you said a second ago that Ahura Mazda created the two spirits, the dependent idea, then the idea would be possibly that he creates these spirits that are neither good nor evil, but have the free choice to choose for themselves, good or evil. And that's part of the idea of freedom, is that you have the opportunity to go in any direction or in either direction, right? So you could choose to follow Ahura Mazda, or you could choose to reject Ahura Mazda, in which case it's not Ahura Mazda that's responsible for evil, but the choice of the individual. And that goes for human beings as well as this, metaphorical story. All right.
That kind of reminds me of sociology and psychology and the difference of the conscious mind. Like you feel heavy-hearted when you know you did something wrong, and then you feel better about yourself when you do something good. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, in psychology and sociology, when you talk about, certain emotional responses and stuff like that, not necessarily the same as the question of the metaphysical reality, the philosophical question that we're dealing with here. This is more on a philosophical level. The possibility of freedom is, if you can mute your microphone, I am getting a lot of feedback here. So the question, when you get to, I really shouldn't go off into, psychology, sociology, or any of the social sciences here, because, how you feel as a response to how you behave is not necessarily have anything to do with the question of free will, because it could very well be very consistent with what might be called a deterministic worldview. So if you were to take, a philosophy class, like in my ethics class, we spent a lot of time talking about free will versus determinism. But, the idea here is you have a concept of freedom which allows the possibility of choice. And this becomes really fundamental to the whole idea of what's called an ethical religion, or ethics in general. So right now, in this religion, we're talking about this cosmic struggle, and Zoroastrianism tends to be what we call an ethical monotheism. Now, I want to contrast that with some of the polytheism that we've already looked at, because in polytheistic religions, you generally don't have the religion intimately tied in with ethics. It's not that you don't have ethical systems and codes, because every society has those things. And it's not that the gods don't often represent an authority. We saw or we will see when we get to the presentation on the Code of Hammurabi, that the Code of Hammurabi was passed down from the god Shamash to Hammurabi. So the gods stand behind, the authority of the law, but they're not necessarily gods that are interested in giving a moral code in a more general sense. The monotheistic traditions tend to do that, though. So Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism. The closest we get maybe in what we've seen before is maybe the Egyptian concept of a judgment at death, right, by the scale. So you're actually weighed according to whether or not you lived an upright and righteous life, right, whether you've lived according to the balance of Ma'at. The Zoroastrians are going to have something similar to that. But now the key for this whole struggle, this cosmic struggle between good and evil, is ultimately in the hands of mankind. This is a primary teaching in Zoroastrianism. Man is free. Man will choose whether to follow good or evil, and ultimately there will be a victory of good over evil due to man's choice. And again, the reason this hasn't been accomplished yet is because man still hasn't been choosing rightly, and this is a process. Okay, so that's one way that you could view this story, as a metaphor for this idea of freedom. And it's really, really, really important in the religious worldview of Zoroastrianism. So let's talk a little bit about divine beings. You've got two major figures, Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu, right? Already introduced those. You got the good God, you got the evil spirit. They're not equal. Angra Mainyu also goes by the name of Ahriman. That's actually might be more familiar to some than Angra Mainyu. Later also referred to as Shaitan, which is a version, Satan. But you have other beings. So let's take a look at a few of them. The Spenta Mainyu, which would be the Holy Spirit or the good spirit, which becomes identified as a spirit or manifestation of Ahura Mazda himself, going back to that story. Then you've got a group known as the Amesha Spentas. The Amesha Spentas are the holy immortals, and they operate kind of like the archangels. They're like these 6 beings, 3 male, 3 female, that represent different concepts. Vohumana, supposedly the one that came to Zarathustra to bring him over to monotheism, is the figure that represents good thought. Ashavahishta, the idea of right and truth, which is symbolized by the sacred fire. Kshatriya, which is sovereign power. Armaiti, devotion and piety. Harvatat, perfection, and Anmeritat, immortality. Okay, you don't need to know any of those names. Okay, then you've got this figure Zurvan, which I already introduced. This is the primordial neutral being, usually represents the concept of time, and in Zurvanism becomes a really important figure, but is otherwise rejected by Orthodox Zoroastrians. And then you've got the category known as the Azata, which means those worthy of worship. Okay, so in a general sense, we could think of these guys as servants or angelic figures, and there's a whole bunch of previous deities put into this category, including the 2 at the top, which are the most important, Mithra and Anahita. Mithra was originally a solar god, a god of covenant and contract. We'll actually look a little bit at Mithra later on when it gets to the Greco-Roman mystery cults, okay, because there's going to be a mystery cult dedicated to Mithras. Anahita, early mother goddess or great goddess figure in ancient Persia, probably represented water as a Yazata. And then there's a number of characters like Hauma, Atar, Shrosha, and Rashnu that are also kind of big figures. But those are lesser beings. So there's only one god that you worship, and that's Ahura Mazda. But the pantheon obviously gets a little bit more complicated. Now, let's talk about their scriptures, because like I said, these are a people of the book, and that means they must have had a written text to be a people of the book. Now, the Avesta are the sacred scriptures of Zoroastrianism. Now, what remains of the Avesta, it's basically compiled during the Sasanian period, or maybe I should say recompiled during the Sasanian period according to the tradition. It's 21 books, 6 different parts. The oldest sections, the Yasna and the Gathas up at the top. The Gathas being the hymns attributed to Zarathustra himself. and they're actually interwoven into the section known as the Yasna. And then you've got the Corda Vesta, Vesperad, Vendidad, and other fragments that are compiled that fill out the work. Now, when was the work originally written or composed? It's hard to say. Again, the designations, not just by time period, but also by language. So the reason you could tell the Yasna and Gathas are older is because they're written in an older language that we call Old Avestan, which is close to Indian Sanskrit. And then the later works are written in other dialects, right? Later Persian dialects like Pahlavi and Pazand. Anyways, what remains today is a fraction of the original scriptures. And the story is that the Avesta was lost during the burning of the city of Persepolis, which was the capital built by Darius. It was burned by Alexander when he came through, and it was lost. Now, there are other stories that say it was burned by Arabs or Mongols or Turks during different invasions. So there's still a question as to when it was burned, when it was lost, when it was destroyed. And then I think some people have even speculated whether it was ever written down and whether it was actually ever lost. And some people that go kind of along with that theory would say it's possible that this was an oral tradition, because the story is, it was burned and lost and preserved orally until the Sasanian period when it was rewritten. It's possible, however, that it was an oral tradition all along and was put into writing, the theory goes, when the Arabs conquered Persia. And the support for that idea is what I was saying before. If you have the Muslim domination of Persia and people under Muslim rule were extended certain privileges, if they could be considered peoples of the book, then it would be in the interest of the Zoroastrians to put their oral tradition into writing so that they could be peoples of the book. So it's kind of an interesting notion, but again, the tradition is there was an older version way back when that was destroyed and then it was rewritten. So I'll kind of leave that up to other people that are more geared towards this kind of scholarship. Now, let's finish up by covering a little bit of the doctrine. And I may have already talked about some of these things, but at the core is a competition between Arta and Druj, or righteousness and deceit, truth and the lie. And that's going to be, again, Angar Mainyu versus Ahura Mazda. This is also the participation that human beings have in choosing truth over deceit and their free will choices. Now, when it comes to the judgment, it's going to be following a little bit of that Egyptian model, the idea of a weighing on the scales. You are judged by your choices in life. If you live a righteous life, then you will pass this judgment. If you don't live a righteous life, you will be condemned. There's not a concept really of a forgiveness, because the concept of free will is so strong that it's the idea, if you've chosen freely, then you are responsible and have to pay for your free choice. It's kind of attached to you from that point forward. Now, in the judgment picture, there is this idea of a bridge called the Chinvat Bridge, which leads you either to paradise, which would be the house of song, okay, if you pass the judgment, and then you'll be judged by Mithra, Sarosha, and Rajnu, some of those Yazata. And the bridge would be wide. It's a wide path, easily to walk down into paradise if you're righteous, but the bridge becomes incredibly narrow, like the edge of a razor, if you've lived an unrighteous life, and then you will fall off the bridge and plunge down into the house of lies. Now, what does that entail? It's hard to say. There are people that interpret different things in the Avesta and in the other writings of the tradition to indicate an annihilation or a permanent torment or even possibly a period of purification, something like a purgatory. So it's, again, there's different passages that hint at different things, but it's bad whatever it is. It's not where you want to go. The concept of frashokareti, butchering my pronunciation, which I probably am mispronouncing lots of things anyways, but frashokareti is this concept of a future resurrection that the Zoroastrians held on to. And this would be the idea of the righteous coming back to a bodily existence in the future. And you also have the concept of Saoshyant, which is a messianic or salvific figure, a future being who's going to come and try to return people to righteousness down the road, kind of a prophesied, future character. Now, the theology behind a lot of this stuff really dates to the Sasanian period. That's where you start to see a lot of this writing take place. So we're talking, the last Persian Empire. The earlier mentions of Saoshyant seems to be in reference to Zarathustra himself. The earliest references seem to just be another title for Zarathustra, and the concept obviously evolves to become this future messianic figure. And it's not just one. There's actually several different figures. I'm trying to remember the names of some of the other ones. My memory is just blanking out, but there's at least 3 of these future figures. Okay, 2 of them that come before Saoshyant. He's the last of the 3. Anyways, that's kind of a synopsis. Like I said, it's still a living tradition. It's more strictly monotheistic today than it is dualistic, but the scriptures are still in existence, the practices are still in existence, and this particular picture that you see on the screen is really the idea of the Zoroastrian temple, which would always have this little fire altar. And again, fire, like I said before, represents arta, represents truth, it represents justice and goodness. So it's kind of around that flame that the devotion is placed. There's not a tradition of depicting Ahura Mazda in a physical form. If you've seen the iconography associated with Zoroastrianism, and I think I did show it earlier in the PowerPoint, but I'm not going to go back and click through it, that is not a depiction of Ahura Mazda. Okay, it's more of a traditional depiction. And anyways, I think that's pretty good as far as covering the overview. Hopefully that made sense. I know I didn't do it justice flying through it as fast as I did, but next time we'll be picking up with a totally different area. So that's the last lecture that's going to cover the religions of the ancient Near East. Okay, next time we're going to actually move into another historical period, which is going to be the Bronze Age Aegean world. Okay, so we're going to be going back, and really the setup and the procedure again is we're going to cover a historical overview of a time period, and then we'll deal with religious views. And if there's a philosophical tradition, then we'll get into that. So that's kind of the future. So that's it for this one.